You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Supreme Court blew chance to erase legacy of law-breaking Kristi Noem, conservative, based on an article by Tom Bogany. Kristi Noem didn't just end TPS. She exposed how power launders cruelty. The power behind the damage. The source story is simple enough. George Will, in the Washington Post, says the Supreme Court's 6-3 conservative majority wrongly dismantled temporary protected status for Haitians and Syrians after Kristi Noem, then leading DHS, terminated it. That decision reached the court only after Noem publicly advertised the intent behind it in language soaked with racial hostility and political contempt. That is the point. The damage did not come from abstraction or bureaucratic drift. It came from an official with institutional power making a decision, then defending the atmosphere around it with the kind of rhetoric that tells everyone exactly who the target is. Noem made the choice. Noem was not a passive administrator caught in an unfortunate legal tangle. According to the source, she terminated TPS for Haitians and Syrians and then, within days, called for a full travel ban on countries she described as sources of killers, leeches, and entitlement junkies. That is not ambiguous policy language. It is deliberate political sorting by race, nationality, and contempt. Will's core accusation is that the court ignored the obvious. The animus was not hidden. It was announced. The justices were not being asked to infer motive from thin air. They were being asked to look at the record and admit what power was doing in public. The court chose not to see it. This is where institutional cowardice becomes doctrine. The conservative majority did not merely accept Noem's action. In Will's framing, it shrugged off the evidence surrounding that action and permitted the legal result to stand anyway. That is how courts help normalize executive cruelty, not always by endorsing the ugliness directly, but by pretending not to notice it when the record is ugly enough to embarrass them. The legal system here does what it so often does when power speaks plainly. It converts political malice into administrative discretion. It turns the governor of a policy into a technical dispute about justiciability, downstream consequences, or judicial restraint. That is misdirection. The harm was not unclear. The court's reluctance was. The blame is being pushed downward. The article also shows how elite politics redistributes responsibility. The real actors are Noem, the president who chose her, and the court that ratified the outcome. But the public conversation around immigration too often gets redirected toward migrants themselves, as if the people being stripped of protection are somehow the source of the crisis. That is the oldest trick in reactionary politics. Target vulnerable people describe the attack as a defense of order, then let institutions debate the decorum of the attack instead of the violence of the policy. Even J.D. Vance's spread of the Springfield pet eating fiction, as Will notes, fits the same pattern. Invent a story, saturate the media space, and then treat the lie as a legitimate response to American suffering. What this story reveals, this is not just about TPS. It is about how contemporary power operates when it wants cruelty with a legal veneer. First, the executive branch names a group as expendable. Then the judiciary refuses to treat openly hostile motive as disqualifying. Finally, the press and political class drift into procedural language that makes the outcome sound more accidental than it was. That is the pattern. Cruelty announced as policy, defended as administration, and preserved by institutions too timid to name it honestly. Will's column matters because it refuses the usual euphemisms. The ugly part was not hidden in the margins. It was the center of the thing, the larger lesson. When powerful officials say the quiet part out loud, institutions face a choice: confront the racism or help launder it. In this case, Noem supplied the motive, the court supplied the cover, and the legal system supplied the distance. That is how state power turns prejudice into precedent. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Raw Story for today's article with the automated voice of Ryan. Thanks for listening.